Actor Bela Lugosi, even decades after his death, remains the preeminent dark personality of the silver screen. His villainous characterizations are still unique, possessing a charming and sophisticated style of evil. Though typecast by movie studios, the vampire of the Hollywood star system could never drain Lugosi's creativity or originality. As Dracula, he wove his way forever into the fabric of the American imagination.
Lugosi's sinister screen style seemed capable of taking us through that pale door that Edgar Allan Poe had once written about. At times his performances were subtle, at times they were particularly overt, but regardless, he seemed able to tap into our deepest fears, to capture our imaginations. On the screen, at least, he was the architect of the night's horrors.
Bela Blasco was born on October 20th, 1882 in Lugos, Hungary. He was one of the 4 children in the Blasco household, growing up only 50-odd miles from the castle of Vlad the Impaler, the real-life Dracula of world history. Though Lugosi would later become a voracious reader, he rebelled against the stress of formal education and the rigorous discipline of his father Istvan's home. At an early age, he trudged away from Lugos, never again to return. For a few years, he worked in the mines of Hungary, and later on a railroad. He finally broke into the theater profession, first appearing on stage in 1902. During his early years, he took the last name Lugosi, which simply means originating from the town Lugos. Several years of success followed, with Lugosi's performances ranging from Shakespeare to all of the great Hungarian playwrights. By 1913, Budapest's prestigious National Theatre accepted him into their repertory company.
If ever there was a man who was born in front to be an actor, it was he. Acting was his home, his life.
You see, in the National Theatre of Hungary in Budapest, all the great character parts are played by 4 or 5 different players. Each competes with the other. Each plays a part in accordance with their own conception. And the audience is just as much interested in the actor's conception of the role than it's interested in the play itself.
My father, who was European, knew Bela Lugosi in the old country, you see, when Bela Lugosi was a very famous romantic stage star. You know, he did things like Romeo and Juliet, and he did Molnar, and he did all these famous plays, Ibsen, and all the classics, you see. And he was really sort of a, how would I express? He was sort of a Laurence Olivier of Hungary.
He has spoken to our hearts with a velvet voice, every bit a 20th century actor. We've come to know and appreciate his ability to play such a human lover. When he utters the commonplace, he raises it to new heights. Tragedy has never known such a craftsman as Mr. Lugosi. Theater News, 1911.
In 1914, Lugosi departed the National Theatre and enlisted in the Austro-Hungarian Army. World War I raged until 1918, but Lugosi was discharged 2 years prior to the armistice. He quickly returned to the stage with one of his more memorable roles as Jesus Christ in a Passion play. Once again, he made a mark as a dark and handsome actor on and off stage.
He had been in 11 duels in Hungary. You know, the only reason I was told that you were in a duel was if you were caught in somebody's bedroom with their wife. And he had fought 11 duels. So this was a man who had lived. He was a Shakespearean actor. When you met him, you knew that this man had command. He had poise.
Soon the blooming Hungarian film industry embraced Lugosi. Under the pseudonym Aristide O, he appeared in various melodramas and romance tales. In made several of these at the Star Company, whose corporate logo was prophetically that of a bat. Known as a dashing young star of the stage, he married Ilona Smik, the daughter of an upper-class Budapest family in 1917.
Late in World War II, and as the war ended, Lugosi became very active in politics, very active in the union movement in Hungary. He backed the communist regime which seized power. The regime was only in power 3 months. When it fell, Lugosi had to flee. He and his wife went to Vienna. She stayed a brief while and returned to Budapest. He never saw her again.
After a brief stay in Vienna, Lugosi found safe haven in Berlin's growing film industry. While in Germany, Lugosi starred in multiple films, including a role as a Native American in the adaptation of The Deerslayer. He also appeared in a version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, directed by F.W. Murnau. A year later, Murnau created Nosferatu, a pirated film version of Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula. Despite his growing stature in Berlin, Lugosi decided to immigrate to America in 1921. A lengthy and tempestuous journey aboard ship finally ended at the port of New Orleans. Lugosi made his way to New York City and quickly formed a theatrical company in the Hungarian community. He produced, directed, and starred in numerous Hungarian-language plays. A major Broadway producer spotted him in a version of The Tragedy of Man, and then cast him in The Red Poppy with actress Estelle Winwood. During one performance, Lugosi allegedly clasped Winwood with so tight an embrace that it broke one of her ribs. Though The Red Poppy itself was short-lived, it brought Lugosi strong reviews and led to a series of other productions on Broadway and elsewhere. After making his American screen debut in 1923's The Silent Command, Lugosi appeared in multiple silent films, ranging from romantic comedies to dramas. Most of his silent movies from both America and abroad are now lost or suffering from the fate of nitrate film, decomposing images merging forever with the past.
Bela was a fiery lover offstage as well as on. As a lover, he was a brilliant success. But as a husband, he was simply a fiasco. Ilona von Montag, New York Herald Zeitung, 1924.
Lugosi was in New York in the early 1920s in the theater world, and there he married his second wife, Ilona von Montag. They were married a brief while. She was Hungarian like Lugosi, but she was a bit more liberated than he could stand, and he was a bit more jealous and domineering than she could stand. They married in late 1921. They divorced in late 1924. Not a lot is known about her.
By 1927, producer Horace Liverwright brought a theatrical version of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula to the American stage. Unlike prior depictions of the vampire count, Lugosi brought his dark good looks, thick accent, slicked hair, burning eyes, and aristocratic manner to the role. A great success, the play made 2 West Coast tours after a lengthy run on Broadway.
Disturbing records registered during the first 7 weeks of Dracula disclose mute evidence of the thrilling happenings which occur at every performance. The figures compiled by the nurse in attendance and the doorman stand as follows. Faintings, 110. Shrieks, 20 per performance. Husbands summoned to escort wives home, 10 per performance. Los Angeles Times, 1928.
They said before he would go on stage at the beginning of the play, he would go off by himself, turn his back to everyone, concentrate, and putting it almost in his own words, he says, I became Dracula. It was a period of concentration that he went through where he became the character that he was about to portray.
It was, and the audience loved it, you know. I mean, he would come on with that tuxedo on, you know, I am Count Dracula, you know. And he was very handsome, you see. In the early days, he was really very handsome man.
You have read the book Dracula by Bram Stoker. You have seen the play of Dracula. I have seen the, let us say, the man Dracula. He is here. He is in Hollywood. He walks the streets by day. He works in the studios. Watch for him. Scrutinize his eyes. Dracula is Bela Lugosi. Gladys Hall, Motion Picture Magazine, 1929.
Among his fans was actress Clara Bow, the it girl of the movies. Fascinated with his depiction of Dracula, Bow entered a short-lived but torrid love affair with Lugosi.
It's something that stuck with Bela all his life. He had a portrait, a nude portrait of Clara Bow that he always had in his bedroom till the day he died.
Another short-lived love affair was with Beatrice Woodruff Weeks. After having known each other for over a year, the two wed. Their marriage lasted only 4 days. Weeks' bootleg gin and flapper spirit found little sympathy with Lugosi's old-world attitudes toward marriage.
Do you believe in vampires?
Yes. 3 of them I married.
Talkies had been ushered into theaters in the late 20s, which, alongside the specter of economic disaster, allowed Universal Studios to consider Dracula a real possibility for the screen. At one stage, they had hoped to cast Lon Chaney, the silent cinema's man of 1,000 faces, in the lead role. The great pantomimist died of cancer in 1930. Though Universal at first refused to consider Lugosi for the role, eventually they starred him as the undead count.
I am Dracula.
Master of the macabre, Todd Browning, who had worked on multiple films with Lon Chaney, directed the production, which began shooting in the autumn of 1930.
The texture of the skin there is always very delicate. Watch out! They may be hovering over you, or you, or you!
Bela Lugosi, thus Dracula, thus the horror man, the mystery man of Hollywood, with the lore of demonology, the dark secrets of the state of trance a part of his daily life. Gladys Hall, Motion Picture Classic, 1931.
When you see Lugosi, what do you remember? The first thing is the eyes, the stare, the gaze. We have to remember that it was Lugosi that changed Dracula into a master hypnotist. It was Lugosi that made Dracula a master of mind control over all others. That's not in the book, and it's scarcely in the play. Lugosi took that element of the play, made it his own. The second element that people always remembered when they saw him in person, or even met him, were his hands. Long, tapering fingers, large hands, and expressive hands. And the cliche of Lugosi is that Dracula-typed arch fingers.
Oh, did the role depress you?
Very much. Haunted me. I often dreamed of the dead.
Most people think that a character like he depicted on the screen, like Dracula, they would think the man behind such a thing, a portrayal, was, well, like that. But he, Bela, was entirely different. He was no Dracula.
Bela Lugosi was very studious. He was a very serious actor and took his roles very seriously.
Following the success of Dracula, Universal Studios planned numerous projects for Lugosi, eventually deciding on Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. The studio grew eager to capitalize on their new Lon Chaney.
Lon Chaney's gonna get you if you don't watch out. He's liable to pounce upon you with...
Frankenstein was the logical choice for Universal's next horror film, and of course they wanted their new star, Lugosi, to portray the monster. But Lugosi intensely disliked the idea of a non-speaking role.
He was up on a peak at that time and felt it was below him to take this particular part.
Lugosi refused to take Chaney's place in Hollywood, turning down the role of the Frankenstein monster and the heavy makeup it required. The unknown actor, Boris Karloff, portrayed the monster instead, creating a new masterpiece of horror. The film also produced a new horror film star in Karloff. Unlike the Hungarian, he held little resistance to parts with heavy makeup. Though they were the great horror stars of the cinema, Karloff became the more successful in the long term. The duo did star in a trio of horror films in the early 30s, beginning with an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat.
The drama coach that's been at RKO, her name was Florence Enright, and she said that in order to get Bela to do a wonderful job, she'd say, well, now you don't want Boris to get ahead of you. She meant Boris Karloff.
I used to have autographed photos of both of them hanging in my office behind my desk. And while Karloff never had occasion to come to my office, Bela Lugosi often used to stop by when he was living in New York. And I noticed that whenever he came into my office and he looked and saw these two pictures there, he wasn't very happy at the way they sat next to one another. So after a while, when I knew he was coming, I arranged to take down the picture of Boris Karloff and put somebody else's picture up who wasn't in a competitive situation.
Poe's classic poem, The Raven, inspired their second film, which pitted mad Dr. Lugosi against Karloff's depiction of a wanted criminal. The duo then appeared in Universal Studios' The Invisible Ray, with Karloff's publicity and billing completely dominant over the Hungarian. Lugosi also created numerous classic roles in the films without Karloff. After turning down the Frankenstein monster, he portrayed a mad scientist in the loose adaptation of Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue. His most memorable horror film after Dracula, however, is perhaps the independently made White Zombie.
Who are you? And what are they? For you, my friend, they are the angels of death.
Dear Mr. Lugosi, we, the ladies of the audience, sit spellbound for the space of many hours while you do your stuff. We are thrilled, chilled, and heartbroken in turn. Afterwards, small battles ensue to determine what it is that you have and others haven't. 1930s fan letter.
He sort of reminded me of, kind of like a count or royalty, because he had such an aura about him, you know. Had a European eye. He loved women, he loved wine, he loved good food.
Well, I thought he was a very charming man, but very withdrawn. When I say withdrawn, I meant he sort of stayed unto himself at the back of the set usually. But I kind of remember his smoking his cigar and sitting there and just sort of quietly observing.
I guess I'm pretty much of a lone wolf.
In 1933, Lugosi's private life became public as newspapers ran stories of his fourth marriage. The bride was 19-year-old Lillian Arch. The two eloped to Las Vegas. Though their relationship had high and low points, it became the most important of Lugosi's life.
God, she was a wonderful woman. I mean, she protected him, and Lillian was just wonderful.
And I remember his wife coming on the set, and she was a very lovely lady, and they were quite intelligent and intellectual.
He remained trapped in the horror genre, however, with the vampire's clutches never loosening. The Lugosi image, rooted in the supernatural and the bizarre, had become a finished painting.
The minute that he walked into a room, he had a charisma, a power about him that just put everyone in awe.
It's almost amazing how quickly Lugosi's Dracula slipped into modern folklore. It became an icon, became an image that was so recognizable, and it became an image in caricature. So Lugosi was right on the edge of what an actor can do as far as a serious performance. Go any further, and you have a caricature. Lugosi himself indulged in that. He got a lot of mileage out of personal performances and personal appearances where he would overplay it and get a few laughs. And of course, only 2 years after Dracula first appeared on film, we had Dracula Meets Betty Boop.
Betty. You have booped your last boop.
Let no one leave. No one yet you.
On rare occasions, however, Lugosi did play roles that were not clones of the vampire count. International House, a 1933 Paramount comedy, let him share the screen with W.C. Fields. Also, The Mystery of the Mary Celeste, a drama produced in England in 1935, gave him a rare opportunity to portray a sympathetic part. On the whole, however, Lugosi could not escape the horror genre. Extreme typecasting left him unable to move into non-horror parts. Worse still was the fact that his status within the genre began to slip. Universal even made Dracula's Daughter, a sequel to the 1931 Lugosi classic, without Lugosi's participation.
I asked him once, why doesn't he be diversified and play something else? Play something entirely different. And he looked at me and he thought, and he thanked me and he says, I would like to, but I don't have the chance. I have this voice and I have this faith.
In 1936, objections from British film censors dried up the market for American horror films in England. As a result, Hollywood stopped producing horror films.
Bela was without work. 37, 38, he did next to nothing.
During his unemployment, Lugosi's only son, Bela G. Lugosi, was born in 1938. Given the ups and downs of his own career, Lugosi voiced hopes that his son would enter a profession other than acting.
He loved his family very much. He was very, very much in love with his family and very proud of them. I remember that.
In the summer of 1938, a small theater in Beverly Hills screened Dracula and Frankenstein. Expecting little return on the old films, the management was overwhelmed by packed crowds that kept buying tickets throughout the night. A double feature of Dracula and Frankenstein blazed across the country, becoming one of the most successful attractions of the year and breaking numerous attendance records. The result brought both horror and Lugosi back to Hollywood studios. To capitalize on the wave of interest in horror, Universal began production on a new Frankenstein sequel, The Son of Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff and Basil Rathbone, allowed Lugosi to create the role of Igor, a character that had not appeared in a Mary Shelley novel or in a previous film.
That new terror. Lugosi, sinister, mysterious, evil.
Igor was one of Bela's favorite characters. He mentioned it to me several times, and I'm sure to other people too, that it was his second favorite interpretation.
Lugosi quickly signed to several productions at various studios. Despite a brief appearance with Greta Garbo in Ninotchka, he continued his new reign as a horror film star. These ranged from old dark house comedies to a few serious attempts at new horror film classics.
Recently, newspapers and magazines everywhere carried an amazing story. Reporters saw Dr. Manley Hall hypnotize actor Lugosi to give reality to a scene in Black Friday. Horror-struck, they witnessed the hypnotized actor's mortal agony as Lugosi actually experienced the terror of suffocating to death in a closet.
Let me out, please! I'm suffocating!
Lugosi hoped to star in the title role of Universal's 1941 horror production, The Wolfman. But instead, the studio gave the role to Lon Chaney Jr. The son of the great silent film actor became a major horror film star, portraying in the 40s roles associated with Karloff and Lugosi in the 30s. The Chaney shadow again loomed over Bela, as Universal's new star even portrayed the vampire count in 1943's Son of Dracula. Lugosi did tour in a 1943 version of the play Dracula, which many audiences reacted to less favorably than they had in the 20s.
In the years that have passed since the cloak-wearing, green-lighted vampire first made audiences shudder and shriek, the movies have given the public a thorough education in horror. This intensive course has taken the edge off anything projected in the theater, especially in such plays as Dracula. Helen Eager, Boston Evening Traveler, 1943.
Twice in 1943, he stepped into the shoes of his old co-star Boris Karloff for a tour of Arsenic and Old Lace. Lugosi became the murderous Jonathan Brewster, first portrayed by Karloff in a major Broadway success. Lugosi toured in two versions of the play and frequently revived it in summer stock. And in the Universal Studios release Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, he finally wore the monster makeup he had avoided in 1931. If critics and adults labeled many of his low-budget films juvenile, the youth of America embraced them. In addition to supporting his B-movies at theaters, children turned out en masse to see Lugosi on personal appearance tours and tuned in to his performances on radio programs.
This is Bela Lugosi, welcoming you to Mystery House.
When Bela did make it into more major productions, it was often portraying a secondary role, as he did in The Body Snatcher, his last teaming with Boris Karloff.
You and I should work together. You mean we would sell the bodies to the doctors together? Dig them up? There'll be no digging. The kirkyards are too well guarded. We will, so to speak, burn them.
In the original version of the script, first draft script, there was no Lugosi character. It was just Boris Karloff, and somebody in the front office at RKO thought, gee, it would be a great idea, a great marquee, if we could have Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi in the same picture. And I always appreciated Boris Karloff, who was very, very patient with him in the few little scenes they had, helping me get the performance out of him.
The second half of the 40s found Lugosi on the public appearance and summer stock circuit. The end of the war caused problems for the entertainment business, and the horror genre almost completely came to a halt. Despite his advancing years and absence from the screen, he still exuded the same magnetism of the previous decades.
And I remember the very first time that I saw him, he was coming down a country road, and I was standing with the other actress who was going to play the other old aunt in Arsenic and Old Lace, which was the play we were going to do with Mr. Lugosi. And he came towards us, and we both kind of took each other's hand and said, "Bela Lugosi is coming towards us." And he came and he kissed my hand in that wonderful European style that they do.
He tended to be Dracula off stage as well as on stage in those days. And we went to a very fine restaurant, and naturally the waiter asked if he'd like any wine with a meal, and he sort of looked at the waiter with very piercing eyes and in a voice that was loud enough for most of the people in the restaurant to hear, said, "I only drink red wine." And then when the waiter brought the wine and gave it to him to taste, he held up the glass and looked at it and said, "I like red wine because it's the color of blood."
I remember one night when I was changing into my different costume backstage, I felt these cold lips up and down my back, and I realized that Mr. Lugosi was kissing my back. And I said to myself, well, I'm not going to say anything, he's the star, but he must have like a very strong feeling for me to be doing this. And the next thing I know, the next day, he actually came up to me and said, "I would like you to tour with me as Lucy in Dracula. Of course, you would have to be my baby." And I said to myself, that's an expression I haven't heard before, but I think I know what he means. So I answered him, "Thank you, but I have to go back to college."
Fortunately, a new Abbott and Costello film incorporated monsters into the comedy. After so many tours of Dracula and appearances as Dracula-like vampires in other films, Lugosi was finally back on the screen as Stoker's Vampire Count.
That fiend out of a nightmare, the vampire Batman, Count Dracula.
That was a very interesting experience to see the interaction between the comedians and the horror folk. I remember particularly that because the sets were so dismal and the mood was affected by the dismal sets, even though this was a comedy, that they actually hired comedians that weren't in the motion picture to come onto the set and cut up and do all sorts of pranks just to keep everybody happy and laughing.
My close friend Gretchen Adamson came to visit me at Universal Studios, and I was making a film with Robert Montgomery, and he graciously asked us to lunch, and so we went to the commissary, and sitting across from us was Bela Lugosi with his small child. And Bob Montgomery turned to Gretchen and me and said, "I see where Bela Lugosi is having a small boy for lunch." Of course, we roared. We thought it was so terribly funny. But anyway, the small boy was his son.
Though he had worked vigorously for patriotic causes during World War II, the McCarthy era quickly cast aspersions on Lugosi's politics. Though he denied communist connections, many viewed him as too far to the left politically. Little became of the matter, but Lugosi's career never again reached the level of the Abbott and Costello film.
Did the Red Scare, did the communist witch hunt at all affect him? We know he was mentioned in Senate subcommittee hearings on communist infiltration of Hollywood. He was attacked by right-wing papers both in English and in the Hungarian community on his political leanings. Did Hollywood studios, which always found him an easy figure to ignore, just turn their noses when he went looking for work? Can't answer that question. It certainly has to be raised.
Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Personal appearance tours helped pay the bills, but Lugosi often received little respect from teenagers in his audiences. His Dracula inspired little horror, and he desperately looked for more professional outlets for his talents. One of these was early television.
When he was doing a television show with Milton Berle, and a skit had been prepared for him, and I was present at that performance. And Berle, who also was a master of ad-lib, deviated from the script, and this, of course, was live television, so it wasn't a matter of retakes or anything else, and completely threw Lugosi off balance.
You kill people on the screen, you also kill jokes.
In yet another revival of Dracula, Lugosi and wife Lillian sailed to England for a 1951 British tour of the vampire play.
When the show opened in Brighton, it was a disaster from the word go. It was actually, in the long run, probably a good thing that it did close without going to the West End, because if it had gone to the West End of London without any improvements being made in it, it might have destroyed him altogether.
Dracula never ends. I don't know whether I shall call it a fortune or a cause, but it never ends.
He continued to spoof his own image, appearing at various live events and movie premieres in Dracula attire, as well as starring in low-budget films like Bela Lugosi Meets a Brooklyn Gorilla.
I'm very sad about the way people depict him, because he was a grandfatherly type man. He was very nice. I walked in and he was sitting there with, he had a suit, a white suit. He was smoking a little cigar, and he was reading the Hungarian newspapers. And he was a very sweet, nice, quiet man.
Meanwhile, Lugosi's personal life echoed the erosion of his career. In 1953, he and his wife Lillian divorced after 20 years of marriage. Lugosi's loss of Lillian left him devastated.
He said, I had just, I'm divorcing, my wife and I are divorcing. And he started to cry.
You had domestic? Yes, domestic problems, alcohol, I believe. Alcohol, domestic problem. I had a very young wife. She was 30 years younger than I, and she felt that perhaps she has a right to be happy, not to be chained to an old man.
In the early 1950s, Lugosi faced a myriad of problems beyond his failed marriage. Alcohol problems persisted. He would eventually seek help at AA for those. Interestingly, too, the newspapers reported a suicide attempt on his behalf. It's difficult to know how seriously to take those accounts, and Lugosi himself would later shrug it off as a publicity scheme, him wanting his name in the newspapers. He hadn't meant anything by it. But regardless, that situation is emblematic of what he truly did want, and that was to find work.
In 1954, Lugosi briefly headlined a Las Vegas act at the Silver Slipper as part of a comeback scheme planned by Edward D. Wood, Jr. A low-budget filmmaker, Wood began an effort in the early 50s to return Lugosi to the silver screen.
I think he had mentioned the fact that he was working and was very happy about that, but I'm not sure he was very happy about what he was doing. In other words, these things were basically beneath him, but it was good that he was working.
Bela felt that Ed Wood was his salvation.
And of course he worshipped Bela Lugosi. He worshipped.
The Ed Wood period, a minor episode in Lugosi's career, was a chance for the actor to make money and continue to work. He appeared as the on-screen narrator of Wood's sex-change film Glenn or Glenda, and as the mad scientist who attempts to make Loretta King the bride of the monster.
I will show the world that I can beat master.
Bela shocked friends and fans in April 1955 when he publicly announced intentions to be cured of a drug addiction. Years before, he had become addicted to morphine, prescribed by doctors for his intense leg pains.
He said, that doctor was no good. He killed me, or he's killing me, that's what he said.
My reaction was, when I learned of it, that this was a very, very brave man who was doing something in a very brave and courageous way and made it very public.
He went to the hospital dressed as neat as a pin and walked in by himself and says, I want to be cured.
I went down because I knew he was very sick. And he said he was trying to get unhooked. He looked right at me and says, I'm trying to get unhooked. I said, you will.
On account that I became a new man, a new lease of life, I'm cured. I feel like $1 million. You feel like Dracula really? Oh, sure, that's his best.
While in the hospital, the 72-year-old Lugosi received letters from fans who signed each one a dash of hope. Shortly after leaving the hospital, Lugosi married his admirer, a 39-year-old Hope Leininger. His fifth wife stayed with Lugosi until his death.
I'm looking forward to seeing my fans again in my next picture. Thank you very much. Thank you.
He was almost glazed a lot of times, you know, when you're talking, he didn't even see you. And he was hard to follow. We didn't know where he was half the time when we were shooting or getting ready. But he finally, each time, as I said, when it came, the bell rang, he was there and he did his scene.
Unfortunately, his fans had little opportunity to see Lugosi in new productions. He took his final stage bows in The Devil's Paradise, a low-budget play preaching against the evils of drug abuse.
You are old and you are tight.
He said it's too late. Those was his words. It's too late.
Bela woke up in the middle of the night and apparently had been dreaming. And he became extremely insistent about getting dressed, and he was told Hope almost delusionary manner that Karloff was in the living room waiting for me. And it took quite a bit of convincing on Hope's part to calm him down and show him that there was no one in the living room waiting to see him, and got him back to bed.
He was too old. That was all in the past.
Despite his rehabilitation from drug use and enthusiastic plans for a comeback, Lugosi died of a heart attack in his small Hollywood apartment on August 16, 1956. Allegedly, he was clutching a script called The Final Curtain when he passed away.
And then I came in, and he hadn't been dead very long, very short time, because it was nice and warm. I petted him all over and nothing moved, so I thought, I guess he's dead.
Bela had always mentioned that he wanted to be buried in his Dracula cape, and I suggested to Hope that if that's what she was going to do, that they should send the full dress over and have him buried as in character, go out in character.
When thespian aplomb followed him even in death, Bela Lugosi went to the grave yesterday in the same black cloak he wore to fame as the sinister Count Dracula of the screen. Los Angeles Times, August 18, 1956.
The driver told Hope, he said, let's go down Hollywood Boulevard to make his last farewell, which we did on the way to Holy Cross Cemetery.
After Lugosi's death, Ed Wood incorporated footage of the actor wearing a black cape and lurking about a cemetery into his film Plan 9 from Outer Space. Lugosi knew nothing of Plan 9 or its story, making the film a bizarre, if not questionable, coda to his screen career.
After he died, Lugosi's image as Dracula continued to live on. He was often parodied in popular culture, and his image continued to influence future vampire films.
The search is finished because there isn't, and there won't be, another Bela Lugosi.
Though his star flickered very dimly in the 50s, Lugosi's death and the years since have immortalized him as one of the great icons of the silver screen. If he never found the variety of roles in Hollywood that he craved, Lugosi did etch his way forever into the landscape of horror and the American imagination. With a legacy of classic performances beneath his cloak, Lugosi remains Hollywood's Dracula.
So when you lie abed tonight in your darkened room, and these thoughts give you nightmares, and you dread to look behind the curtains for fear of seeing my horrible face appear at the window, just pull yourself together and remember that after all, there are such things.